This past week, for the first time this Lenten season, I was able to attend the Stations of the Cross and the following meal and program on Wednesday evening. When you come to the stations, as you enter the front entry of the church, on the small table by the font, you find the small pile of bulletins, plus small squares of paper, each with a number on it from 1 to 14. There are a total of 14 stations, and for each station there are responses and a prayer, but also a short reading from Scripture. By taking one of those squares along with a bulletin, you are volunteering to read the lesson at that numbered station. I rarely remember from one year to the next which numbered station describes which occurrence in Jesus' way. So I chose at random and discovered when I sat and looked through the bulletin that the number 8, which I had chosen, is Jesus' encounter with the women of Jerusalem, as told in Luke's Gospel. There followed after Jesus a great multitude of the people, and among them were women who bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." It seemed very fitting to me that I would choose this reading even blindly during March, which is Women's History Month, with my mind full of Mary and Martha. And given my following closely the work of a group producing a documentary of the Philadelphia 11 in anticipation of the 50th anniversary next year of the extraordinary ordination of these courageous women, which was held on the feast day of Mary and Martha of Bethany. In 1974, when these 11 women, who were fully qualified, were ordained in Philadelphia at the Church of the Advocate, I was 2 years out of college and a member of a parish in a nearby suburb. It was my then retired bishop who was one of the 3 presiding at the ordination, the one who had formally received me into the Episcopal Church. I was also a parish delegate to our local deanery, our regional subset of the diocese, and an alternate to the diocesan convention that fall. All this, for those who don't know, was 2 years before the General Convention of the Church approved the ordination of women to the priesthood and opened up the possibility of their becoming bishops as well. Only if you have read the stories of these women can you know the full extent of the uproar and negative reactions there were at the time. We all know that change can be hard and substantive change can be threatening. We know our place in the world and in our institutions, including the church, through long-standing traditions, constitutions, laws. Giving new voices authority, changing structures, or suddenly no longer knowing the words of the liturgy by heart can hit hard for some and be welcomed by others. And even welcomed change is not always easy. Many still refer to the 1979 Book of Common Prayer as the new prayer book, despite how long ago it was published and how many new options have been adopted since then. I know you are now asking yourselves, when is she going to get to Lazarus and his sisters? If that's even where she's going. Like Stephen in his preparation for his sermon last week, I too have been introduced to new voices in understanding Scripture and John's Gospel in particular. I'm referring to scholarly work with original manuscripts done by Elizabeth Schrader, a new faculty member of Villanova University, also in a suburb of Philadelphia, who suggests from her research that Lazarus, in fact, had only one sister, Mary, in the earliest manuscripts, some of which have been redacted to add Martha. In those instances, Mary's name in the texts have been crossed out and Martha's added. This allows for it to seem that this Mary and Martha are the same as the ones in Luke's gospel, though in Luke they do not have a brother Lazarus mentioned, and they live somewhere other than Bethany. She goes on to posit the possibility that Mary of Bethany is Mary Magdalene, and the point she ultimately makes is that if this is so, then it is Mary who becomes the one in John's gospel who names Jesus as the Messiah when he says to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" And she replies, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." Mary thus becomes the central confessor in this gospel of who Jesus is, parallel to Peter in the other gospels. She has anointed him with oil, confessed him as Messiah, is present at the cross, and then is the first to witness and announce the resurrection, giving her a level of authority many at the time or those later creating the canon of Scripture would not have wanted to give to a woman. We can't know who or why the early manuscripts were redacted to add Martha to the story, but we know the effect. They diminished the status of Mary, but at the same time likely allowed John's gospel to be acceptable to those later deciding which books to include and which to exclude from the canon, preserving it for a time when its truth could more acceptably be brought to light. Those in authority then were no more willing to see women in positions of significant authority within the community or the church than has been true for most of the intervening centuries. And yet, this is just another way in which Jesus challenged the religious authorities and the conventions of his time, consorting with tax collectors and prostitutes, healing the man born blind on the Sabbath, speaking alone with the Samaritan woman at the well. All changes to the acceptable norm, attracting some and causing fear in others. Even the response to the healing of Lazarus is mixed. Just responding to the message sent to him of Lazarus' illness causes consternation. The disciples don't want him to go, since the authorities in Jerusalem have already tried to stone him. Mary and Martha in our text are each given the same words, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." A recognition of his ability to heal, but which can also be heard as an accusation. Why didn't you come right away? But it is only Martha who can express trust. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. To which Jesus responds, "Your brother will rise again," which Martha misunderstands, and Jesus then goes on to say those amazing, reassuring words. "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." But Jesus means something more than the end times, something immediate, contending that the life he offers is not merely an end-time promise, but something that makes a difference here and now. And then as Mary, Martha, and those with them meet Jesus, we see the depth of his humanity. They are all weeping at the loss of a brother and friend. Yet even that stirs mixed reactions. Some declare, "See how he loved him," while others complain that if he could cure the blind man, couldn't he have prevented this from happening? And then they come to the tomb. The stone sealing it is rolled away, and Jesus calls out to Lazarus to come out. And he comes out still wrapped in the burial strips of cloth. And Jesus bids those present to unbind him and let him go, inviting their participation. We would call this a miracle, but in John's gospel, it is a sign, something that reveals the character and commitment of God to God's people. Lastly, we hear that many of those present who had come with Mary and seen what Jesus did believed in him. Yet in the verses that follow, this same miracle or sign leads those who oppose him to plot his death. You might think that raising someone from the dead would be unlikely to cause such opposite reactions. Some witnesses brought to faith, and others feel threatened and are hardened in their opposition. As the writer David Lose writes, I've wondered if this is always the way it is with God's activity. That is simply because God's activity will change us. It will comfort some and threaten others. Even the promise of new life, that is, comes only as good news to those who recognize that the old life is not enough and only threatens or upsets those who don't want to change. And certainly we see change all around us and among us. We see in our culture fear in response to so much, and with it a desire to some to exert control over what books are available to children, the choices women can make about their own health and bodies, new understandings of gender identity, how our own history is taught. Closer to home, we struggle with the right way to effect desirable change in the housing of those living on our streets, or the increased density of our neighborhoods to accommodate the increased need for housing in general. And here at St. Paul's, as we look to be truly welcoming, we can't help but wonder how we may be changed by incorporating those who do come. But as David Lose also reminds us, God's work in our lives never leaves us unchanged, and that God will accompany us into the unknown future. And here we are, living in that unknown future dreaded by so many 50 years ago. Women as priests and bishops, even archbishops. I want to close with a poem by Khalil Gibran about fear and terror. It is said that before entering the sea, a river trembles with fear. She looks back at the path she has traveled from the peaks of the mountains, the long winding road crossing forests and villages, and in front of her she sees an ocean so vast that to enter there seems nothing more than to disappear forever. But there is no other way. The river cannot go back. Nobody can go back. To go back is impossible in existence. The river needs to take the risk of entering the ocean, because only then will fear disappear. Because that's where the river will know it's not about disappearing into the ocean, but of becoming the ocean.